This video is going to start off looking at front-end as a service and where it fits in the Sitecore positioning in the Sitecore composable world. So first, what is front-end as a service? It's platforms enable brands to build, test, and deliver engaging front-end experiences faster, better, and more cost-efficient. The idea is that it handles all the design and coding needs for the experience, and front-end as a service platforms follow the headless principles, which means they are separated from the back end, focusing exclusively on the front-end experience itself. So you might hear things like, we want to unify the experience across all sites, and we want to use the same components across all these different sites that don't necessarily use the same platform. So some of them may be built on React, while others are built on .NET, and others are built on Next.js. So how do you unify these? Or the only unified experience we have right now is our design system on Figma, and that's not really maintainable because each team goes and implements it in their own way. We might hear things like maintenance of different sites is a pain. They're built on different technologies, and updating the component library means updating tens of projects. We need to separate between the platform that we use to build our line of business applications, websites, and EX, but we want to have a unified and shared content. These are all things you hear about when front-end as a service becomes a good fit. Something like content as a service, and then we want the front end for it. API-driven content, headless content, these are words that you commonly hear when you start thinking about front-end as a service, or when your customer is mature enough to start thinking about front-end as a service. Examples of front-end as a services are things like MoveWeb, Mobify, and Fantastic, BitCloud, Microsoft Graph Toolkit, Acquia Site Studio, and we're going to really go through these and talk about them in more detail because they are quite different from one to the other. So let's move forward. So first, let's look at the types of front-end as a service. We have what we call micro front ends, like BitDev, where the idea is usually thought of as a composition of independent front ends that happen at runtime, either on the server or on the client side. So the idea is you're ultimately merging atoms and molecules together to generate these micro front ends, and these can be from different locations. Composable front ends like MoveWeb, Mobify, and Fantastic are a large focus today in commerce. It's a big interest in the commerce space. The idea here is providing a way to easily compose front ends, widgets that integrate with different backend systems and can be reused on multiple sites and apps. Specialized framework agnostic components, such as the Microsoft Graph Toolkit. These are specialized because they're a reusable framework agnostic components, so they can work on any framework, but they usually do a very specific thing. So in our case, Microsoft Graph Toolkit it provides authentication providers for accessing and working with the Microsoft Graph, as well as components that work with Microsoft Graph. Component builders like Acquia Site Studio and of course Sitecore components are ways to easily create component layouts and functions for your content authors. So why don't we see these in action and talk about them a little bit more? So I'm going to just go into the actual a demo of some of these capabilities. So Bit and their site is actually built using Bit, so you can easily see which components are being used for each of these. So you can see this is a UI heading component, this is a UI content subtitle, this is a UI button, and this is a UI copy box. You can see that each one is actually coming from a completely different location. So this is coming from Team Bit Community, this is coming from Team Bit Design, and so on. And this is how you compose front-end as services through micro front-end. So you can think of a page like this, which is actually composed of base React and content image, and then you see that it has button, the hero, the header, the home, and all these things are somewhat composed from others. So the home is composed from the header, as well as the shoes card grid, and then each one, the shoes card grid itself, is composed of the shoes card, and so on. So you get the idea of that composition of different items. That's what micro front ends really does well. And it's all about this concept of atomic design and the atoms and molecules and how you're able to compose your component from these atoms and molecules, and hence your pages. Composable front-end platforms, again, just like what we were talking about, enable you to build your front ends in very easy steps. So you compose your own tech stack, you choose your tech stack that you want, and then you start building your modern front end. You can use coding or a kind of a WYSIWYG designer to create your components, and then you start working through them and integrating them with your backend. Moving forward to the Microsoft Graph Toolkit as a third kind of idea of how people went about implementing front end as a service, Microsoft Graph Toolkit is used across the whole Microsoft ecosystem. So in Word, in PowerPoint, in SharePoint, in Teams, all these different apps actually utilize the same Microsoft Graph Toolkit to show things like a person card, for instance. So this is the default person card, and you can see here that it shows you a lot of information about a person, their org chart, and all these different things. But one important aspect of front end as a service and these micro front ends is that they should be extensible, they should be configurable. So you should have the ability to say, I don't want to show all that in some scenarios, and you'd be able to, and as well as be able to template it. So for instance, here, Microsoft gives you the ability to use the MGT person, which is their kind of person component, but add your own template within it. So here you can see that it has a template of the type person card, and within that, it's able to add something called additional details. And if I hover here and open, I'll see that my additional details are here. So the stuffed animal friends has been added now. And this provides that extensibility because, again, one thing that is unrealistic is assuming that your front end as a service has to be rigid. On the contrary, you want to do what most of your front ends need or most of your apps need. However, you want the flexibility where it makes sense for different apps to be able to extend it and customize it in their own scenario. So let's say, for example, in my website, my marketing website, I might want to hide some of this information, whereas show it in my intranet portal, for instance, but use the same component because it has so much more functionality than that. Finally, jumping to Acquia. Again, for Acquia, creating components is very similar to that same concept. So you go in and you write the title, the category, for example, for it, if you want to add a preview image. And then within the layout canvas here, you can start adding your layout. So you'll see here, as I click through, what I can do is I can start dragging and dropping a container. I can start dragging and dropping an image within that container, a heading, and this is very similar to how Sitecore Components works. And once I'm done, I'm able to go into these elements and customize them. So I can add like a default image here, for instance, to give that experience of a default image by when the user adds it. And I can just apply. One thing that's pretty neat, I think, here in Site Studio, again, I'll just show it here. When I preview, it looks kind of ugly because I see here I'm missing some padding. I'm missing styling in general. So I can go back to my normal mode and then go to my container. And you'll see here I have that ability to go in and add styles. And one thing that's great here, which they've done, is that they've added these styles. Either you can go in and say custom CSS, but that's not the default. Default is based on your design system, what you've defined as your design system items. You can go in and change it or use from these predefined set of styles that your admin or your designer has created as part of your design system, which is something that I think is very important as part of any front-end as a service, is providing that mechanism for your design system to take precedence over overriding, because you don't want your front end as a service components to look completely different than each other. You want them all to adhere to the same experience, that's one, and two, to be accessible. So you want to be able to have it accessible, and three, you want to make sure that they work well in responsive design. And I don't mean on mobile, web, and tablet, for instance, only, but I mean for also people with magnifying glasses or that zoom in or putting it on a sidebar versus the main container. All these things should work seamlessly. So here you can see you can override the information as well, and enter it yourself. And now you have a completely different looking component widget. And this is really that third type which Sitecore is going towards, I think, with components. I'm going to just jump back to my presentation, kind of to go through a little bit more about why these different types. So now that we've understood these different types, I want to detail a little bit more about what you should expect from any front-end as a service platform. First, it should be able to connect to different systems. The whole idea is composability. So it shouldn't be rigid, that it only connects to Sitecore, for example, backend. And this is something that Components does. It does connect to different systems and different third parties, and it has different connectors to Contentful and other systems. It should be reusable across sites. So you should be able to get the component itself and reuse it across different sites. Again, this is something that Components does provide out of the box because it is built on with that concept of front-end as service. It's built, your front-end as service component is created as a web component in the Shadow DOM. So that means that its styling does not affect your site, and your site stylings don't affect it, which is super cool. The only thing I'm not sure whether it's supported right now or not is the ability to push attributes or to pass attributes to your Shadow DOM or to your components, such as theme colors, variables, attributes like we've seen with the Microsoft Graph Toolkit, to template it or to extend it. I'm not sure if that's supported or not. I have not seen it in any of the demos, and I don't have access to components right now. Thirdly, framework agnostic. Again, we said Sitecore Components does use HTML web components, so it is framework agnostic. You can use it in React, you can use it in HTML, Next.js, whatever you want. And finally, it should be composable through a component designer, which again is a check mark for components, because you are able to compose these designs. And I definitely recommend everyone to watch the video that on the Sitecore side that talks about how that's done and actually shows a demo of that. Now, going back to front-end as service and looking at it further, one important aspect is, yes, it's great where you have that drag and drop capability where you can create container images and so on, but you should also have the ability to write your own HTML. This is very important because you want to enable and give the power to your front-end developers to do more advanced capabilities while retaining this single unified front-end as service. I remember when SXA first came out, before Scriban was supported, and having to add everything through that insert field. Yes, you can do a lot with it, but it was very frustrating to get what you want rather than writing your own HTML templates through Scriban. So I definitely think this is something important to be supported. Again, I have not seen it in components right now, but I don't know if it exists or not, or whether it's on the roadmap or not. And these are really kind of my checklist to say whether I see that this front-end as a service platform has potential or not. So the first one is design system adherence. And when I say design system adherence, I'm not just talking about colors and typography. I'm talking about a full design system. So I'm talking about having that support for end-to-end design system capabilities, like, for instance, of course, your typography, your colors, your primary colors, your neutral colors, and so on, but also your layout, your spacing, and defining the spacing, your elevation for containers, your shadows, your iconography. You should be able to design all these or add all these or import them from Figma at least into your design system. And as we saw with Acquia Site Studio, you should be able to have these as defaults for your users to use and leverage, with the ability to override in case they need to, but it should always rely on these design system guidelines to ensure that the code written is as similar and as adherent to the design system as possible. Second thing is multi-site branding. Again, since we talked about a design system, you want to be able to also customize parts of it, such as variables like your primary colors, like your typography, because your spacing, because you might have a design system for your website, your landing page, and then one for your partner portal, another one for your intranet. It's going to have the same primary colors, I presume. But for example, in landing pages, you may want to make spacing more. You may want to give it this website feel more, whereas a portal, you may want to give it that app experience more. So you should be able to do that by just changing the design system without having to change your components themselves or having two copies of each component. Responsive, again, we talked about this when I was going through it, but the idea of responsive is not just media queries. We today live in a multi-experience universe where people are using websites through so many different devices and with different disabilities and accessibilities that they need. So the idea of people zooming in 125%, 135% on a screen does not mean that they should fall short or see something that is not correct. And to ensure that, you need to do responsive, not media query responsive. That's one part of responsiveness. The second one is your component should work well anywhere you put it, whether you put it in the main part of your page or on a sidebar of your site. It shouldn't break in either one of them. And this is where things like container queries in CSS would help dramatically, but your front end as a service framework has to support that for you to be able to do that. Accessibility compliance, of course, is really, really important. And this is something that time and time again, I see front end as a service tools are more of marketing gimmicks where they show you the experience and how easy it is to create. But then when you start using it in the real world, it's not accessible. The contrast ratio is really bad and it doesn't tell you any errors or doesn't warn you about that, which again does hurt your brand. So people start going back and reverting back away from them if they don't have the power to first adhere to the design system and second, be able to create their own visual code or override the code when they need to cater for things like that. And generally new CSS feature support, such as container queries, such as clamps, so that your font size can grow and shrink based on device size, for instance, for things like banner titles and large headings like so. Composition from atoms, again, it goes back to our design system adherence. Most of design systems are going through the atom molecules, elements, components, and so on and so forth. And in order to do that, we need to cater for having these atoms shared, and then compose your app or your components from these atoms rather than having every single time to drag and drop the title and then define that the title font size should be an H3 or its type should its HTML type should be H3 and then its class should be XYZ. You shouldn't have to do that. You should be able to just say there's an atom called title, there's an atom called summary, there's an atom called an avatar, and the system should cater for that for you and compose your items through that. And again, these atoms should have attributes and properties that you can turn on and off specific abilities or specific capabilities from them as well. And finally, Figma integration. Figma is the go-to design tool for me, at least, and for a lot of other people. So integrating with Figma is a no-brainer for any front-end service platform. So if we were to say how I would think of a workflow for a successful front-end service platform, I think components, firstly, is in the right direction. It's on the right direction. It's something that's absolutely necessary. And I think Sitecore nailed it by announcing components so early in the game, as soon as they launched cloud, to compete with things like Acquia Site Studio, but also they still have a long way to go to really support the full capabilities of a component builder plus a front-end service tool. So things like, again, design system. So the way I think of it, it's really a four-step workflow. First step is design system. Enable you to define a full design system, not just a color palette. So it's typography, colors, layout, spacing, elevation, icons, and so on and so forth. Everything you've designed in your Figma design system, you should be able to do that. All your foundation should be here. 2, atoms and elements. Again, enable the creation of well-defined atoms that can be used to compose your components rather than free-for-all design where everyone's just doing their own thing, to have this common experience rather than, again, going back to just a PowerPoint kind of experience or a canvas where people are just adding whatever they want. Third is extensibility, ability for templating parts of the component once developed to enable reusability, as well as the idea of slots or placeholders to enable children to be added within it. again, this is something we've seen with the Microsoft Graph Toolkit, and it's something that time and time again I see missed in front-end services, and it ends up having card v1, card v2, card with read more, card with image, and that breaks the whole concept of reusability because you're ultimately just creating the same business component hundreds and hundreds of times. And finally, validation checks. We know that if we want business users to be able to create front ends, we need to help ensure what they're creating is really working for everyone. So it needs to be accessible. So the ability to auto-validate that the design works on different devices, different layouts, so that it works on design sidebars and main content. So really that resizing of it and that responsiveness, showing it at least to the user and showing him how it would look like in different layouts as part of the preview rather than just showing the preview on mobile, desktop, and tablet. And two, make sure it's accessibility compliant, screen reader compliance, contrast, of course, and all these other accessibility checks have to be there, and ensuring that it's at least WCAG AA compliance is essential for that. So again, just as a final look, I see that components is on the right direction. I still think it has a long way to go to really be a true front-end service, but I think it's a great start from Sitecore as a first version of components, and can't wait to get my hands on it really.